it feels nice to be at a point in my life where I have my own business and I can be part of the community at a greater level and just feel like I have a family that's just beyond, the four walls of my home. Because I like coming in every morning and seeing the same faces and making the same coffee and having the same chats and, seeing people bring in their children as they're growing up with a venue. And it's I think, by far and away the most rewarding part of the growth of the business.
This is the Deep in the Weeds podcast. I'm Anthony Huckstep. After years working in the industry and gaining enough skills and confidence, many hospitality professionals roll the dice and start their own business. But as they soon discover, it's hard to maintain a viable business with rising food costs, rents, wage costs, and the whim of the diner. Throw in bushfires and a pandemic and things become even trickier. What impact has the last few years had on those building their dream? Eric Morris is the owner of Bistro Clementine in Sydney. Eric, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thanks for having me on the show.
It's good to have you here. You opened a beautiful little establishment in Sydney just a few years ago now. It's been a pretty wild ride, but you're still here. Well, what's it felt like for you?
It's been the biggest challenge of my life for sure. I think anyone trying to guide their business through the ever-evolving landscape, be it hospitality or otherwise, would probably give you a similar answer. It's been a really big challenge, but on the other hand, it's also provided a lot of learning opportunities and a lot of time for personal growth, I think emotionally and professionally as well, which, you can't really put a value on. So you've kind of got to balance out sort of all the downsides with some positives, I think. And, I'm hopeful that when we cross over this river, there'll be greener pastures for all of us.
And tell us a little bit about Bistro Clementine. When did you first see the site and realise that's where you wanted to build this restaurant? Well,
I actually started a few years earlier at a cafe location next door. So we're in Piermont down the end of Harris Street. If you've never been, it's a little peninsula close to the water. And I had wanted to open a little wine bar restaurant with some friends in Newtown or Enmore a few years earlier. And we weren't ever able to bring that to fruition, mainly due to a lack of viable real estate at the time. And I had all this money that I'd sort of taken out from the bank and didn't really have a job. So I just needed to get started on something. So I remember heading down Harris Street one day to go look at a business that was for sale on Gumtree, which would end up becoming the cafe. And I had never really walked down Harris Street before, and there are these beautiful old trees sort of lining both sides of the street. And as you come to the cusp of where we are on this corner of Harris and Scott, sort of opens up into the water, and it's quite a beautiful sight. And so that sort of was the first time that I felt like I could make something work in this particular part of Sydney, which I previously hadn't had much experience in. I'd mainly worked in the inner west. And I sort of battled it out at this little 20 square meter coffee shop for a few years. And then the shop in the corner, which is where Bistro Clementine is now, became available to lease in 2018. And so I had always wanted to do a wine bar restaurant concept. I did the coffee thing for a few years just to try and get a handle on running a business by myself. I'd been left in charge of running someone else's floor before, being the GM of Bloodwood, and working previously at lots of other restaurants. But I think going out on my own, I wanted to start off small, and if I failed, I wouldn't feel too bad because it wasn't my whole heart into it. So I decided to throw my full self into it in 2018 when that space became available.
What was the state of that space when you took it over, and what did it take to bring Bistro Clementine to life?
It was a pretty sorry state when I picked it up. It had been a few mismatched concepts before. The previous owners had run it as a sort of tapas, in inverted commas, restaurant, which was just an excuse to have a whole bunch of small plates that didn't have any cohesiveness whatsoever to my mind. And before that, it had been a Middle Eastern restaurant, I believe, and there were three styles of flooring within the venue. I think two types of elevation. The walls were this really cold, dark grey, and the architraves were all, for lack of a better term, poo brown. So there wasn't anything really attractive about the location, but the bones of it were fine. There was this wall that was dividing essentially what had previously been two terraces, which I had knocked down by the landlord, so it was an open space. And then from there, we pretty much gutted it and started again, with the exclusion of the kitchen, which we sort of left because the bones were fine. It had extraction. We got new furniture for it and new cooking equipment, but the whole internal space had to be completely redone, which suited me fine because, I've worked in venues before where, you go into them and there's a really great sense of direction when you're working. It's all about workflow, and having bought my previous venue, it hadn't been really designed with any considerations to that whatsoever. So I'm glad that we didn't have any restrictions on what we could do. We had a clean slate, which, although expensive, definitely, I think, helped bring the whole concept to life.
Well, I want to talk about that concept in a little while, but take us back to when you were young. Where did you first step foot in the hospitality industry?
My first job in hospitality was at Gloria Jean's in Hornsby, Westfield, when I was 17. I didn't care too much for school. I didn't do terribly at it. I didn't mind going, but I'd rather be doing something else. So I took a lot of time out in year 12 because I had a lot of major work, so I didn't have to be at school too often, and I would be working at Gloria Jean's. And I really enjoyed the process of crafting something and learning something new and working with quite a big team, and sort of the thrill of the pressure when everyone's sort of pushing as hard as they can. And from then I was hooked.
You ventured over to London at a young age and ended up working with Ottolenghi, of all people. How did that come about?
That was a pure fluke. I worked in the Gloria Jean's as a way to gain a skill that I could use internationally, assuming I could speak the language. And I'd always wanted to go to England, London in particular. And when a friend and I went in our gap year, I just applied for a few jobs on Gumtree, I believe it was, and you sort of do your little research and look at the venues and see what they look like. And Ottolenghi stood out as something that looked like a nice venue to work at. I mean, I never really had been in restaurants before. I'd only been a young guy growing up in the suburbs. So the closest I really got to fine dining was a local pizza shop. And it was a whole new world working with Yotam. He wasn't there all the time. I was in the Islington store. I think they were opening up the Notting Hill store at that time. And he was sort of in and out, but he was a really genuine person to work for with a really strong sense of hospitality. And he was very friendly, very open, answered all of my questions without hesitation. And the group of people who worked at that particular venue at that time was just such a wonderful experience, I think, as a first restaurant to sort of be part of. And I was pretty much just stuck in the little coffee corner on the side, and occasionally I'd be asked to do some dinner shifts, but I was mainly there during breakfast and lunchtime. But it was my first true exposure to really delicious, well thought out, executed food that had a great sense of pride and self and had real personality. And that sort of drove me forward to when I came back to Australia to, keep on pursuing hospitality and make it my career. So I think without that passion at the start and being exposed to it, I don't know if I would be where I am now.
You mentioned coming back to Australia. What were the steps that you took to take a career path in hospitality?
I decided to go to a hotel management school. I didn't really know much about how to get entrance into hospitality. I think like a lot of people who begin, you might apply to a restaurant and they often need someone with experience. That was certainly the case where I was growing up. I was in the North Shore around the Hornsby area. So I just applied at all the local restaurants at the Westfield, and no one would really hire me. So I decided that going to a hotel management school would probably open a few doors that I wouldn't otherwise be able to. So that was my first step into the career, just signing up and showing up for the course. But aside from the academic part, which I don't think has much use truly, unless you want to be in hotel management specifically. If you wanted to work in restaurants, I think the best thing is just to show up and sell your work for free for a few months and just get a foot in the door. But I did meet some good mentors whilst I was there. So there was Peter Cocaruto, who was at the time the GM of China Doll on Finger Wharf. He was one of my tutors. He taught front of house. There was this restaurant that they have where, the local business people can spend $25 on a 3-course meal and all the students prepare and serve you, which I don't, it's, unique to them. It is a common theme amongst hospitality colleges, but he was teaching that. And I pestered him enough until he gave me a job at China Doll. And that was really where I started to learn more about the restaurant industry and sort of put what I was learning into practice in a real world application.
Do you have any stories from your time working on the floor at China Doll?
It was all a whirlwind, really, at China Doll. I remember just the busiest services just about of any venue that I've ever worked. I was probably too young to have any real good stories there. I was bouncing around from work from 6 o'clock till 10 o'clock, getting a train back home to Barara at midnight and then turning back up to school at 7 in the morning. So I didn't really have any time to make any stories there, unfortunately.
What was it about the front of house that attracted and lured you?
I think it was the romance of the front of house. Originally, I wanted to be a cocktail bartender. I thought they were, the coolest part of the team. I worked with this really great Frenchman in Ottolenghi when I was there, and he just had so much suave and charm that I thought that'd be a fun thing to do. So that was originally my goal, was to get into a cocktail bar. But unfortunately, wherever I went, I was always just pushed on the floor as a runner, either due to inexperience or perhaps they just didn't need anyone in the bar. So I sort of stuck it out there, and I found a groove, made a little niche for myself. And over time, I found that wine was just as appealing to me as cocktails were. And there was more room for me to banter along with customers and to learn something that had a surprisingly large amount of depth to it that I hadn't considered before. So working on the floor appealed to my intellectual sense, where there was a lot to constantly learn. Menus were always changing. You're exposed, especially as a young person, to so many different styles of food. And I worked across a vast array of restaurants. So I could learn about all these cultures through their food, and then supplement that with coming across new wines and spirits and all the rest of it. So I found that suited my personality, and didn't seem to have such late closes behind a bar either, which was a plus.
You've worked at many venues across Sydney. What were the real key venues and moments that shaped who you are?
After working at China Doll, I worked at establishment in the time of sort of Frank Roberts and Franck Moreau being on the floor before the Ivy opened, two pillars of the Maryvale behemoth. Peter Doyle was still there as well, and Josh Nyland was an apprentice in the kitchen as well. So there were a lot of really interesting people, and I think that working in that environment where there's so much detail and precision being executed at every level, I think that was probably what honed me the most in the craft. I love rules and strategies and procedures. I think without them, it can be very chaotic very quickly, whether you're in the back of house or the front of house. And working with those people who had really spent, their whole lives becoming the best in their fields was really, really inspirational for me to, I think, just have the self-discipline to continue and push forward and really try and bring the best every day. And I remember when I was, in a running section, I worked with a fellow called James Sexton, who was Young Waiter of the Year a few years back. Now he's the winemaker at Mainridge and the Mornington. And I think I'd been bollocksed by Frank Roberts at the back for not dropping a plate at the right time or something considerably minor, but still, quite a big deal. And I just felt like complete shit. And I remember James just saying, it's not what you fuck up today, it's just fuck up less tomorrow. Whatever you didn't do well today, just come back and just do better at that. And just gradually, chip away at it until you are where you want to be. And I think that level of professional expectation is really something that helped me grow. I don't know if it works for everyone. I don't think everyone likes being in that kind of pressure, but I really enjoyed it. And that was probably the most definitive experience that I went through. Otherwise, working with the guys from Shady Pines, opening the Baxter Inn, the Swillhouse Group, I was a sort of sommelier bartender there. They created a role for me because they wanted to have a wine program. I wanted to learn how to tend a bar. Like I said, it would have been a dream of mine forever, but I sort of got stuck waiting tables. And those guys just made such great venues that were all focused on customer experience and giving a great product, but having a really good time. And if you create that for your guests and you can create this experience, then everyone benefits. And that was something that was very different to working at a venue like Est or the fine dining venues where I worked before, where you don't see good service. It's very quiet, it's very self-assured, but you don't notice it. Whereas in venues like Hubert or Frankie's or the Baxter Inn, they're so lively and there's so much energy and passion, which still comes across as a great product, but then it also elevates the experience to such a level that they became one of the best bars in the world, and they have this whole stable of truly amazing venues, which are known the worldwide.
You mentioned your love and interest for wine. Was there anyone on your path as a mentor that helped you towards becoming a sommelier?
There were quite a few along the way. A lot of sommeliers are very open about their craft. When I was working at Est, there was Matt Swoboda, who would go on to open Love Tilly Divine, and Dear St. Eloise, who was studying sort of at the same time with me. He wanted to go down that path, and he would often challenge me. We worked at Bestsellers together, and we often would have tastings sort of in the back room. I think Joel Amos and Mike Benny were also very formative at that time, very fun people who would reward curiosity, but in a more professional sense. Working at Bar and Grill, Rockpool Bar and Grill, as part of the opening team, Sophie Otten was an amazing mentor. Not a lot of people would give me as much of their time as what she did, and she writes, across Australia in the wine industry, and I think is very well known and regarded. And certainly, she was just very patient and fed my curiosity while sort of keeping it under control. Because sometimes I could maybe ask a few too many questions during service. But she was probably the person who inspired me the most to continue learning, even when it seemed like it was too much to take in. I think I was 22 or 23 when I went to go do my quartermaster sommelier certification, and I hadn't really picked up the books until that point. So I just went to the library, got all the recommended texts, and just read and read and read before service, during our break, after service. And Sophie was always very, very helpful in keeping that flame going and that passion sort of stoked. So I'm very lucky to have had her as part of my my path.
Well, what makes a great sommelier from your perspective, and what is it that you like to deliver for a great experience?
I think a great sommelier tailors an experience to their customer. Everyone's knowledge is going to be different in the dining world. So being able to move past your own preconceptions of what wine are and being able to talk more on the level of the customer, I think, is what really defines great sommelier. And then beyond that, being able to communicate in a way that people will be engaged with. And that does differ from person to person, but most sommeliers that make me want to be better at my job tend to speak in more evocative and emotive terms, less so about, the specifics of the density of vines per hectare or how long something's spent on these or what have you. It's more about the story of the person who made the wine. And I think that we're very lucky that wine can carry the sense of terroir and sense of person and place. It's like a time capsule. And the context of that wine is what makes the wine more enjoyable than just what's in the bottle. So I think a good sommelier will tap into that and try and elevate, the craft of what the winemaker has done into something that's more of a tapestry of the culture and the world around us at large as well.
You mentioned Bloodwood a little while ago, an amazing local restaurant hub of the community in Newtown, very different to the likes of Rockpool Bar and Grill. What was it like running the floor there compared to somewhere like that?
It was a great challenge. There's so many personalities working at Bloodwood. Newtown's an amazing place. I have a great fondness for the inner west and the menagerie of people who live there. There's a lot of artists, a big queer community. Everyone's quite young. Everyone's like a lot of students. It's really a challenge to be able to make that team of, sort of pirates cohesive. At least it was, a decade ago. But it was a lot of fun, and there's so much love in the community there. Like you said, it is rather important to the Newtown area. They were sort of the first venue of that ilk, coming from Claude's fine dining themselves and creating this really lovely community-focused venue which catered to all types of people, all types of diet. There's no pompousness or anything else. It's just really simple food done well, and they're doing big numbers. Like they're doing 220 people on a busy night out of this tiny kitchen. It's like 6 by 2.5 meters. It's not that much space. 3 people crammed in there with a dishy. So it had this energy to it, which it was really special to be a part of. And right now that they're a piece of furniture in Newtown. They've gone the distance. I think they're up to their 11th or 12th year, just about. So it was really nice to be able to be part of that story for a short time. And I got to inherit a really beautiful venue off of Gabrielle Webster, who went off to open her own venue and then on to Icebergs and a few other bits and pieces on her own path. But she was also a wonderful influence in the wine scene, and she left me with, a great wine list to be a custodian of and a really great team to lead as well. So, it's not so much of what I did, but it's just I guess the whole element of Bloodwood is built upon all these wonderful different people, and it was just nice to be a block in that piece of Lego in that tapestry.
You mentioned that you were the custodian of the menu. It was passed on to you. Well, but was it quite different to drinks menus you'd experienced before? Was it tailored different for that market?
So taking over the wine list from Gabrielle was very different to what I had experienced before. Just a few years before I took over, the natural wine scene had really started to make an impact in Sydney. So Gabrielle was a big proponent of the wine scene with, Yalma, James Erskine, Lucy Margot, A Coat of Barrels, Dandy and the Clos. And that was a big influence on me. I'd mainly been, studying, Burgundy and Bordeaux and the wines of Germany and all these old marks, which were sort of very distant for me to access unless I was working at somewhere like Rockpool Bar and Grill, where you're opening up all these wonderful European wines. They're quite exclusive So coming to work at Bloodwood, which had a more community-focused angle, the wine list sort of portrayed that by showcasing these younger domestic winemakers, and that I think opened not just for me, but for Sydney in general. This new wave of lo-fi, minimal intervention, natural wine, however you want to dice it up. But it was very much a movement of by the people for the people. And I think in other industries besides ours, we could all embrace that ideology a bit more and might come off a better way for it.
Let's talk about Bistro Clementine. You opened it the same year as the bushfires, and there's been a pandemic since as well. What's been some of the real challenges for you as a first-time operator?
I think the most consistent challenge I've experienced since opening has been staffing. We're a small venue, so we require a small but competent workforce, and that's becoming rarer and rarer in the days of COVID. It was already hard before. I remember our head chef at the time, Craig Gray, when we opened, he had left by the end of the year. So we opened in February 2019 and he resigned in November 2019. And we had, 3 or 4 weeks to sort of find someone before he left. And then we would have the Christmas holidays and then reopen for January. And in that time, we weren't really able to find someone to fill the role that adequately, but we did patch the hole for a while. And then we reopened in 2020. Our chef, I think, was there for 1 week before he left to New Zealand, and didn't really give me any notice. And I feel sorry for anyone who came in January or early February because it was me cooking. And I'm by no measure a chef. I was just doing sort of simple dishes that Craig had helped me write so that I could get through until I found a new chef, which we did maybe 4 weeks later. And I think by March we had COVID. So that fellow who had started was a British citizen, didn't have any support. At least it didn't seem like he was going to have any support when the pandemic hit. So he had to leave. And then it's just been a ever-changing roster since then until this year, where we've landed on our chef Valent, who'd been working at Café Parsi prior to the lockdowns. And he's stayed on this year, but so far he's been the most consistent chef that I've had. I think the whole time I've had a venue, chefs have been the hardest part of the puzzle. As a front of house operator, I'm dependent on all of my staff to be able to support me in sort of achieving my concept, because I'm not able to step back and do the job back of house. I can make cocktails, and I can make coffee, and I can run a floor, but I can't cook. So finding people who you can rely on is really, really difficult, but also very important. If I could do it again, I would probably look to hold off until I could have a chef as part of the business, so there's some skin in the game. When you're hiring people, there's certainly a relationship and a rapport that you hope keeps them going in the venue, and you want to create an environment that they enjoy being in. But people's circumstances change and priorities change, and as a result, it's meant that the consistency of the product that I'm able to offer changes. And that's been the biggest challenge so far. Is I might have whatever I have in my head is what I want to achieve, but without the skills and manpower to back it up, it's not something that I can deliver on every day. And that's a horrible feeling as a proprietor.
Tell us about what the offering was at Bistro Clementine prior to the pandemic, and what you've had to change it into to adapt and survive. So
the bistro originally opened as sort of a modern take on a European style bistro. So Craig, who was the chef who opened, had worked in France for 2 years, in the UK for 3 or 4 years before starting. So he felt like he had quite a strong finger on the pulse. And when we were talking in sort of the conceptual stages, we liked all the same venues in Europe. So the menu was quite modern. We had a small range of small snacks to start. French-inspired menu that had a lot of charcuterie elements to it. We made our own pate. We would do veal sweetbreads. We play around with very classic French ingredients, but repackage them in a more modern offering, and that worked for a little bit. But where we are in Piedmont is a very conservative area, and we weren't able to get the dining community that maybe you would have in Surrey Hills, Newtown, Darlinghurst, who might support something that's a bit more progressive. The Wine List 2 was sort of in the same ethos. It was European natural wines and Australian small producers, which isn't by any measure like changing the game in Australia. This is sort of, I think, what most younger hospitality professionals enjoy eating and enjoy drinking. So naturally, you'd want to try and mimic that in your own venue. But moving through the pandemic and the bushfires and having to pivot, I guess being the term, we have started to offer more of a classic bistro range. So we dropped, a lot of the smaller, bite-sized dishes that you could be a bit more playful with in favor of, more classically established sort of modern Australian bistro classics, let's say, like burrata's everywhere at the moment. So we have whatever this season's burrata is. We'll still do a terrine and a pasta, maybe a classic duck and beef dish, but we've certainly had to go a bit more conservative in our offering. Also because there's not any room to make errors anymore. The margins are so fine that we have to really appeal to the broadest selling categories at the moment. So whilst we might want to do something that's a bit more left field using ingredients that we would really like to play with, I think the area where we are has more determined the menu that we're able to offer. So by doing something a bit more classic, like steak frites is always a really strong part of our menu. Appeals to everyone. Doing a hamburger, but doing a nice hamburger, it's an everyman's food. So we've had to follow that path a bit more, still with our style, we would hope. So it's still speaks of us, but definitely it's a lot more different to what we expected that we'd be able to do when we opened.
Hospitality is renowned for slim margins, and restaurants surviving the first couple of years, the odds are not very good in the industry. How have you managed to survive so far in these couple of years with bushfires and the pandemic? I've
only really managed to survive by not taking a wage, which is the harsh truth of it. I started my cafe, and I think the most money I ever took in a year would have been about $50,000 as an income. And I think I average about $25,000 to $30,000 a year. So the only way I've managed to get through is by being okay with that. And that hoping that my sacrifice will lead to something down the line. And I'm just hoping that, it's all worth it. I think there's some benefits of having your own business, like being able to be your own boss is sometimes a great reward. It's also sometimes a great hell. But generally, I think I like it more than I dislike it, which is why I've kept going. And there's definitely a sense of pride that I don't want to give up. I want to try and see this through to a point where I can break away and be proud of what I've achieved. And I think I just had to come to terms with the fact that, money is only worth as much as you want to put a value onto it. And I'm able to have a roof over my head, and, I eat all my meals at work practically, so I don't really have to pay for anything there. And, that's just the lifestyle that I've chosen. But I can understand why so many people give up along the way, because it takes so much sacrifice to be able to push ahead, and you really have to look forward to the next stage. And I'm grateful to have my fiance, who's very supportive, and she keeps me on the rails when I feel like throwing it all away. But it's really just that. I mean, it's just how much are you prepared to give up? And I just realized I was prepared to give up pretty much everything to try and make it work. But you don't really know that until you're faced with the reality of that situation. So, that's the point that I'm at now. And I'm just hoping that next year, when we get through the most current phase of where we are on the COVID spectrum, that people come back with a vengeance, and they're prepared to, maybe pay a little bit more than they were expecting to pay a year or two ago, because I think we're going to have to see some prices increase. Everyone's demanding a fair wage, which I believe in. Superannuation is going up. Rent's always going to be going up. And I think we have to start valuing our input as a collective. I still get baffled walking past places that can try and offer a bacon and egg roll and a coffee for $6.50, $7.50, $8.50. I don't think that keeping the market artificially low in favor of competition is going to help anyone in the long term. So I think we all just have to start valuing our own efforts a bit more, and hope that if we do it as a collective, then people will just have to to deal with it.
You mentioned at the top of the show that it's been a period of time of learning for you, and there's been positives as well. What positives has there been, and what's changed for you?
I think a lot of it's just been personal growth and having to manage people. Your perspective shifts a lot when it's your bank balance that's being affected by your decisions. It's kind of easy to be a bit more of an artist when you're being paid a consistent amount every week. But I think when you're the owner and you have to, make concessions or make decisions that will affect your livelihood, you just have to, I think, grow beyond the constraints that you've placed on yourself. I mean, I know that when I first opened the bistro, I had such a strong idea of what I wanted, and I thought that I'd go to my grave with that level of pride, and I just learned to be able to grow away from my ego as much as I could, so that we could have more customers in the venue who would enjoy themselves more. Because at the end of the day, that was what was more important. I just wanted to be able to do that and have our original core concept sort of survive. So you sort of learn to be able to move on. Definitely, I think you learn an appreciation for all the work that your staff do, and try and make sure that you communicate that to them. That's something that I'm still learning to do effectively. I tend to get sort of bogged down in my own thoughts of how am I going to navigate this week to get my bass paid, or save up to buy a new fryer because this one's on the fritz, or what do I have to cut here, that I forget sometimes to say really to my staff how truly deeply thankful I am for them to be there and supporting me, because without them I don't have a venue. So you learn an appreciation for, I think, for all elements that go into to making a venue. And I certainly also learned to say sorry for my mistakes, because I do make a lot of them. So I know I can be challenging to work with sometimes, because I can be a million places at once and drop the ball a little bit. So learning to be softer on yourself can sometimes be good too.
What do you love about what you do?
I love making people's experiences memorable, really. I like talking to people and getting to know them. I mean, Bloodwood taught me a lot about community. Working in Newtown with the Newtown locals, they have the festival, and seeing how tight-knit everyone was as a business community was really inspiring. So it feels nice to be at a point in my life where I have my own business and I can be part of the community at a greater level, and just feel like I have a family that's just beyond the four walls of my home. That's probably been the most inspirational part of it, and I think what keeps me going, because I like coming in every morning and seeing the same faces and making the same coffee and having the same chats, and seeing people bring in their children as they're growing up with a venue. And it's not something that you can replicate, I don't think, too terribly easily. So that's been, I think, by far and away the most rewarding part of the growth of the business, is becoming part of the community.
Well, Eric, having experienced your interpretation of hospitality, you are one of the best in the country. It's genuine and beautiful, and I hope to see it continue beyond this. And I know how much you're putting into this. We've loved having you on Deep in the Weeds today to hear your story. I know there's so much more to it, but please keep in touch and we'll catch up again soon.
Thank you so much for having me on, and I hope everyone else, keeps the good fight going, and we'll go through it together and see each other all at the pub soon, I hope.
This is the Deep in the Weeds podcast. I'm Anthony Huckstep. Stay tuned as we take a deep dive into the lives of the incredible people who ply their trade in the food and hospitality sector. Special thanks to executive producer Rob Locke for making this all happen. Follow us on Instagram at Deep in the Weeds Podcast, or email us at podcast@deepintheweeds.com.au. Stay safe and be well.